Yeah, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this, our second deep dive into one of the three or multiple exposure drafts that accompany our sustainability consultation. Today, we are going to be using the chat and the Q&A, and I wonder, just to test that our technology is working, if you might want to drop in the chat for us where you're joining us from today, so we can just make sure that it's all working. Thank you. Welcome, Elizabeth. Welcome, Asana. Great. Our tech's working. We were made aware that at our last webinar it may not have been, so great to know that it's working today. What are we going to cover today? We will be doing a deep dive into the ethics and independence proposals. We'll run a very similar start as to what we did for our 5,000 deep dive last week, for those of you who joined us there. But for those of you who weren't on that call, we will give you a little bit of scene setting, and that will cover what we are consulting on, give you a little bit of a flavour of some of the international developments, and then I'm going to pass over to Karen, who's going to lead you through a deep dive into the actual ethics and independence proposals. And we'll finish with a reminder on opportunities to engage further. So without further ado, what are we actually consulting on? Well, we've issued a consultation document exploring alignment with international standards on sustainability assurance, independence and ethics, as well as use of experts. This consultation document closes on the 10th of October. This covers a number of standards. This is in response to 3 new international standards that have been issued. The first is the Engagement Performance Standard, which we call an exposure draft on the New Zealand equivalent to 5,000. If you missed the webinar last week and you wanted to learn more about that one, the recording is available on our website. Today, we're going to cover the middle one, the ethics and the independence standards relating to sustainability assurance engagements. And then next week, we've got a deep dive into the third aspect, which is using the work of an external expert. Remember that that last exposure draft applies to both sustainability assurance engagements as well as financial statements, so that one might be of interest to a slightly broader audience. Our proposal is to make this package of standards available for use for periods starting on or after 15 December 2026. As a brief reminder as to how this package may work in the New Zealand context, the 3 standards on sustainability assurance, where we think this may be used, is optional for mandatory GHG emissions assurance engagements, and then also available for use on voluntary assurance over other information reported in climate statements, but also more broadly on any type of sustainability information. So it's quite a broad-ranging topic. The second part, just to re-emphasise, is that the revisions to the code on using the work of an external expert apply also to financial statement audits and reviews, and this we're proposing to be mandatory. So we do need your views on all of these topics. Briefly, just to give you a little bit of context around the international landscape, and this slide is specific to the ethics and independence requirements. Around the world, many jurisdictions are currently working through processes just like what we are to explore making this standard or adopting this standard. Of interest or key relevance to us is our counterparts across in Australia. In Australia, the ethics standards are issued by the APESB. They have adopted and issued this ethical standard, which will be applicable for periods beginning 1 January 2026. So this will be a mandatory standard under their climate reporting regime from an ethical and independence perspective. Other jurisdictions, for example, the UK, the FRC is currently evaluating how to incorporate the Code of Ethics And this is what we're currently doing and what many jurisdictions around the world are currently exploring. And that's why we need your views. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Karen, and she's going to do the deep dive into our proposals. Thanks, Karen.
Thanks, Misha. So today I am going to talk you through some of the key proposals in our exposure draft for the International Ethics Standard for Sustainability Assurance, including the International Independent Standards for New Zealand. And throughout this proposal, I will be referring to the standard by a slightly shorter acronym of the IESSA NZ. So firstly, I just wanted to get a quick sense of who we have in the room with us today. I have two quick poll questions, and they are: one, do you currently perform greenhouse gas or sustainability assurance engagements? And two, do you use professional and ethical standard 1 to perform these engagements? Thank you, and I will launch that poll now. Might give it a couple more seconds. So we've got some answers still coming in. So I see we have a great mix of people in the room, which is great. We have some who do greenhouse gas or sustainability assurance engagements, some who don't, and some who use PES1 and some who don't. So hopefully this webinar will provide some useful information for all of you. So if we move to the next slide. So why was the IESSA developed by the International Board? So at the time of its development in 2022, it was the same time that the International Assurance Board was talking about developing an assurance standard for sustainability assurance engagements. So the IESSA was designed to underpin the assurance standards, with ethics and independence being a key part of the assurance standards. It was developed to give a global baseline and to increase trust and confidence in the reported sustainability information. It was developed to be practitioner neutral, and developed so all assurance practitioners can apply it. And it was also developed in response to a demand from investors. So investors were demanding financial level assurance as supported by strong ethical and independent principles. So next slide, please, Misha. So the key characteristics of the exposure draft for the IESSA NZ. So firstly, like I just said, it's profession agnostic. It's been designed to be used by any profession and any sustainability assurance practitioner, and all requirements and proposals are written at that level. It has also been designed to be framework neutral. It has been designed to be applied to any sustainability reporting framework and sustainability assurance standard. It is equivalent, and by that I mean it is equivalent and provides the same ethical and independence requirements as those equivalent to financial statement audits. And it is standalone. It is a standalone part to the, it's proposed to be a standalone part to the code, and it can be applied in its entirety without the rest of the code of ethics. So on this slide, you can see the proposed structure of the IESSA's Code of Ethics. So we have, for those of you who are familiar with it, we have part 1. So part 1 is the fundamental principles. So those being objectivity, integrity, professional competence and due care, confidentiality, and professional behaviour. And then we have part 2, which are those provisions that apply to professional accountants in business, and part 3, which is the ethics, which apply to professional accountants in public practice. And then you have parts 4A and 4B, and those are the international independent standards. Part 4A applying for independence of audits and reviews, and for part 4B applying to the independence requirements for assurance engagements other than audits, reviews, and sustainability assurance engagements. And as you can see, Part 5 sits to the side of those and is a separate, as I said, separate part to the code, which includes all of the proposals for the ethics and independence for sustainability assurance practitioners. So the next slide shows what I find quite an interesting slide, just a summary on a page of all of the different parts to the IESSA and all the different considerations within the IESSA. So as I said, we've got the IESSA has the two parts. We've got the international ethics standards and we've got the international independence standards. The international ethics standards have the same five fundamental principles that I just talked about in the extant code, and also the conceptual framework, and that is the same, and that talks about identifying threats, evaluating the threats identified, and addressing the threats by eliminating or reducing them to an acceptable level. Then you have requirements on pressure to breach, and these are peculiar to or particular to sustainability assurance, and this deals with any pressures to behave unethically, potentially explicit or implicit pressures. So examples of pressures such as greenwashing and how to behave ethically when exposed to those pressures. Then the conceptual framework, which covers, as you can see, conflicts of interest, using the work of an external expert, and NOCLA, and we will cover some of those in more detail later on in this webinar. And then the independent standards. So these apply to, or these are scalable to public interest entities. So some of these requirements only apply to public interest entities, and public interest entities for sustainability assurance are defined in the same way as for financial statement assurance. So just as a reminder for in New Zealand, our public interest entities are those financial market conduct reporting entities with higher levels of public accountability, or tier 1 charities and public sector entities. And under the independent standards, we also have considerations with other practitioners and non-assurance services, as well as long association, which again we will cover later. So next I wanted to move on to some key, the scope of the proposed, of the exposure draft, the IESSA NZ, and the scope of those ethical proposals and the independence proposals that I just talked about a minute ago. So the scope of the ethical proposals is broader than that of the independence proposals. The ethical proposals apply to all sustainability assurance engagements and any other service that is performed to the same client. Whereas the independence proposals apply to sustainability information reported under a general purpose framework, which is publicly disclosed or required by law. So those are the two differences in scopes between the two parts of the IESSA. And next I wanted to move on to some key definitions that are new in this exposure draft for the IESSA, and are new because they pertain to sustainability assurance. So the first one is the sustainability assurance engagement. This is defined within the new proposals, and this can be either limited assurance engagements, so limited assurance engagement being the minimum level of assurance required for the assurance of the greenhouse gas disclosures within the climate statements, or the assurance obtained in a review engagement, or reasonable assurance engagement, and that is the level of assurance that is obtained over financial statements. Also, sustainability information. Now, if you attended the webinar last week on IESSA 5000, the Sustainability Assurance Standard, you heard me talking about this term in that webinar. So the IESSA and the IAASB have aligned the definition of sustainability information across both the Independence and Ethics Standard, the IESSA, and their IESSA 5000 standard. And sustainability information is information about sustainability matters. And those sustainability matters are those environmental, social, governance, or other sustainability related matters as defined or described in law or regulation or relevant sustainability reporting frameworks. The EDIESA also includes some examples of sustainability information. So it includes examples of that it might be historical or it might be forward-looking. It might be prepared for internal purposes or for mandatory or voluntary disclosure. So while there are some helpful examples in the IESA around sustainability information. And there is also another term for group sustainability information. And I've included this because the IESA includes a lot of proposals about the independence requirements for groups, and thus defines what group sustainability information is, being information from over for a group. So next, I wanted to just talk a bit further about group sustainability information. Now, from this slide, I just wanted to show how the reporting boundary of sustainability information can be wider for sustainability than it would be potentially for financial reporting. So in the middle there, we have our group components, our sustainability assurance client, the subsidiaries, and the related entities which form part of our group component. With the sustainability assurance client, if that sustainability assurance client is a publicly traded entity, then the sustainability assurance client would include the subsidiaries, so the direct and indirectly controlled entities and related entities of that sustainability assurance client. If it were not a publicly traded entity, the sustainability assurance client would include the independence considerations would include consideration of the entities which the sustainability assurance client controls directly or indirectly. But I also wanted to highlight the value chain components, and those are those components that can be further down the supply chain. They can be suppliers and customers, and they can represent information that is included within the sustainability information that is reported. And what I wanted to highlight here is that there are different independent considerations for the group component and the value chain components, which I will go on to in more detail in the next slide. So firstly, a group component. So that's a component that's required to be included in the reporting entities group financial statements. And the proposed requirement here is that the firm has to be independent when performing a sustainability assurance engagement and has to apply the conceptual framework to identify, evaluate, and address threats to independence. And then we have the value chain component. And this is a component within the reporting entity's value chain. And this is a component that is not included in the group's financial statements. And the requirement here is to require independence of a firm and an assurance team members in relation to the entity on which the assurance work is performed. So for example, doing the assurance of the greenhouse gas disclosures in the climate statements, as the group lead auditor, the group lead auditor needs to be independent of the whole group. If that same group lead auditor is doing work at the value chain component, then they would need to also be independent of the value chain and the group. If a value chain component was doing work just at the value chain, then they would need to be independent of the value chain entity on which they are doing the work. So on the next slide, there are some more proposed requirements about performing assurance work at a component. So there is no need for a physical presence to perform work at the component. And a group firm has determined to perform assurance procedures at a component to obtain evidence for purposes of the group sustainability engagement. And the group procedures are performed on the data or information maintained by the component. So the guidance is regarding the meaning of performing the assurance work, and it determines the applicability of independence provisions. The reason behind this is to promote a consistent application of this across all entities and a consistent approach with the audit work performed at the component for group audit engagements. So given that often with sustainability assurance engagements, it may be that work may be performed more often by other practitioners. The IESSA has also included requirements to reflect those considerations that are in this IESSA 5000 Sustainability Assurance Standard around whether the group firm is able sufficiently and appropriately involved in the assurance work. So, for example, as the lead partner at the client, I need another practitioner to do some work that covers the client and the group component. The lead partner is able to be sufficiently and appropriate involved in the assurance work and is able to provide instructions as to how that work should be carried out. If the work is being done by another practitioner and it is on the client or a group component, then that practitioner, if it is part of the network firm, independence is required from that network firm and from the firm to the group and client. If the practitioner that is doing the work is outside the network firm, then independence is required for their whole network from the client and the group client. So from the entity that they are assuring and from the group entity. If the other practitioner is doing work at the value chain component, then the independence required of the practitioner is required from the value chain component only. There are also other requirements for when the group firm is not able to be sufficiently and appropriately involved in the assurance work. So firstly, there is some work being done at the group component of the client, and the lead audit partner, the lead firm, shall request confirmation or is required to request confirmation of the firm's independence and that they can perform that work. The practitioner that is performing that work is required to meet the independence requirements of a sustainability assurance team member. So those requirements are the same because because that practitioner becomes considered part of this sort of sustainability assurance team and needs to meet the same requirements as the sustainability assurance team. If the work is being done by another practitioner at a value chain component, so for example, work has already been carried out at the value chain component and it has been supplied to your entity or it's been supplied to you and you are looking to see whether you can use this work. For independence purposes, the independence is required by the other practitioner from the value chain component. And as a lead group entity, you may request a statement of independence from the value chain component assurance practitioner to confirm this independence. So the IESSA has taken a pragmatic approach to independence at the value chain. And these are the proposals that they have included in the IESSA. So there are also some, in the same way as in the extant code, there is also consideration that the provision of non-assurance services might create threats to compliance with fundamental principles and independence. So there is a requirement to consider the impact on the provision of non-assurance services on the sustainability information on which the firm expresses an opinion. There are also some general proposed provisions. So there's a general provision to prohibit any services that might assume management responsibility if you are assuring the sustainability information. There is also a self-review threat prohibition for public interest entities. So if there is any service that may create a possible self-review threat that may be evident if you are performing sustainability assurance, then that is prohibited for public interest entities. And there are requirements for communication with those charged with governance. The list of non-assurance services is similar to that is included in Professional and Ethical Standard 1, the extant code, but there are some sustainability specific services such as forward-looking information, which is considered to be found more often for sustainability assurance. There is also considerations for non-compliance with laws and regulations and when that must be communicated. So if the client is an audit client of a firm or a component, and you discover as part of your assurance work at that client that the client has a breach and has not complied with law or regulation, then you're required to communicate that to the lead engagement partner. If the client is an audit client from outside the firm or outside the network firm, then the sustainability assurance practitioner shall consider communicating this when they are outside the firm. And long association. So if the firm has not served, for long association, you need to consider both the length of time served on the sustainability assurance engagement and audit engagements together. So long association is the risk that there may be a familiarity threat or a self-interest threat with regard to long association at a client. There are conforming amendments to Professional and Ethical Standard 1 as a result of this requirement in the ED IESSA, and there is a transitional provision, and that will apply when the firm has performed. So there are transitional provisions that apply when you start, when the IESSA is started to be implemented. So just a couple of quick questions following that. And I will put them up on the poll. Do you agree with the proposal to adopt the ED IESSA NZ in New Zealand? And is your firm intending to transition to the ED IESSA NZ for sustainability assurance engagements? And I will just put those up on the poll now. Great, thank you. Well, we have 100% of you who agree to adopt the EDA as NZ, so that's good. And mixed around whether your firm is transitioning to the IESSA. So thank you for participating in that poll. And now I want to move on briefly to a few of the proposed amendments that we are proposing to make to the international standard for New Zealand purposes. So the first of these amendments is a signpost, really. It's a signpost to our domestic temporary standard for assurance, NZSA1, which is for a standard for the mandatory assurance of greenhouse gas disclosures in the climate statement. And this signpost is to say to direct you back to NZSA1 when conducting these assurance engagements, because there are requirements within this temporary assurance engagements for independence. So that is the first of our compelling reason changes. And the next of our changes are really to replicate the amendments that have already been made in the extant PES1. So as I said earlier, the IESSA NZ mirrors the extant code. And so there are some compelling reason changes that we've made in the extant code that we believe are also applicable for sustainability assurance. So these include proposed requirements relating to the disclosure of safeguards, proposed requirements relating to a prohibition for an assurance practitioner to accept or pay referral fees, proposed requirements when an assurance practitioner identifies multiple threats to independence. So when they individually might not be significant, but the requirement would be to evaluate the significance of those threats in aggregate and to apply safeguards to eliminate or reduce them to an acceptable level. And there's also additional application material to advise practitioners to seek legal advice when disclosing confidential information and regarding the provision of tax advisory planning and advisory services. So I just have another poll here, just asking about the compelling reason or New Zealand amendments. So first of all, do you agree with the proposed New Zealand changes to the IESSA? The first one, to clarify the scope and to signpost back to our temporary domestic standard NZSA1 for the independence requirements. And do you agree with the proposed New Zealand changes to the IESSA NZ to replicate the amendments in PES1? And I will just launch that poll now. Thank you, everyone who's voted. And we have yes to both of those. So thank you for your time in voting for those. I just want to move on now to some of the upcoming events that we have. So as Misha said at the start, this is the second of 3 standards that have been launched internationally. So this is the second deep dive that we have done into the standard, and there is a third one to go next week. That is relevant to both financial statement auditors and sustainability assurance practitioners, and that is revisions to the code addressing the work of an external expert. And also we have our panel. We have a really distinguished set of panelists. We have an IASB member and a member of the IESSA and an experienced assurance practitioner to talk through a panel discussion on this consultation. So I really hope you can join us for that, because I think it will be a really informative discussion. And I will hand over to Misha now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. That was a whirlwind tour through quite a detailed and complex standard. And I do hope you've got some questions lined up for us. So while you think about what questions you might want to pose, I also just want to remind you about a current separate consultation that we're running, and that's related to seeking your views around extending the adoption provisions within both the climate reporting and assurance standards. So that's a separate consultation. It is running concurrently, that actually closes before this consultation on all of these standards. So please do drop us a note or respond to our survey on this topic by the 24th of September, and then separately respond to our consultation by the 10th of October. I do want to open up now for some questions. So I'll let you have a time just to think about whether you've got any. I do see one in there, Karen, and I think it emerged when we were talking about all the different sort of components and groups and the independence requirements. So what if there is a material supplier-based emission factor used by the climate reporting entity? Would the practitioner need to apply the independence requirements to the supplier, given they would need to obtain evidence over that supplier-specific factor?
That is a really interesting question. So I guess there's a couple of things. It's first of all, consideration whether the supplier has already had that emission factor assured. So whether you're going to whether you're sort of looking at it as there is another assurance practitioner involved, and then you will be looking at the independence of that assurance practitioner because they've done the assurance work. If you, as the lead assurance, the lead engagement partner, is looking at doing work over that emission factor, then they and you are looking at whether and actually doing the work at that component or at that supplier to find out the information, then I would think that you would be applying the independence requirements because you are actually doing the assurance work over that number yourself. So it sort of becomes part of those independence considerations. Hopefully that answers the question.
Value chain requirements take a bit of time to get your head around. So yeah, we'll ponder that a little bit more because I think that's quite specific to the factor as well. So it's a great question. We'll take that away and ponder it a bit longer. I don't see any other questions coming through. Probably quite a bit to digest there and think about. But thank you for your attendance today, and thank you again for your participation in our polls. And yes, we do look forward to receiving further submissions, or drop us an email, or any other way that you wish to give us your feedback will be very, very much appreciated. Oh, I see one more question coming through. If we adopt the IESSA standards in the NZSA1 opinion, does this replace the standards we have, or do we include it as an additional standard?
Again, that's a really interesting conversation, a question even, not conversation. And we have been discussing that internally as well. So something that we are talking about, I would say, Misha, is if we do adopt the IESSA, if we do bring it into bring it into PES 1, and then it would become part 5 of Professional and Ethical Standard 1. But that is something that we are still thinking about as part of if we sort of adopt the standard for New Zealand.
As far as I can understand the question, I think what we're saying is currently under NZSA 1, you're required to follow the independence requirements in that, and then you're also required to identify what additional ethical and independence standards that you've applied. And I think in this instance, it's a naming issue as to whether a revised standard takes on a title which identifies exactly which version you've applied. I think that's the guts of the question. I think we have to first work through our process for adoption and then work through that matter. But it's a great question, and I think it's also around transparency to the market, just to be very clear exactly what independence requirements you have applied. So it's something we will work to clarify. Do you see any other questions coming through?
No, I can't see any at the moment. I think that.
Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your participation. And yeah, reach out and let us know what you think in due course. And then have a great afternoon.